Hello, and welcome back to another edition of U.S. History. We will begin covering part two of the beginning of our Gilded Age unit, and we will be looking at new industries. So today in this video, we'll be looking at new technologies and how they're going to affect the way of life for many Americans. Okay, so part one, the expansion of industry. So, throughout most of American history, it was primarily an agricultural society. Okay, as we go into the Civil War, we see that start to change as America is depending, especially the North and the Union Army is depending on factories to supply weapons. One of the things, if you remember from eighth grade history, is that the Civil War was one of the things that made the Union Army such an enormous advantage. Is the fact that every soldier had a weapon. Okay, they had a good weapon, whereas in the Confederacy, there weren't very many factories in the South to supply weapons. Okay, but you see, despite that, by 1920 we're going to become the leading industrial power in the world, and there are three factors for the reasons why this happens. First is natural resources. Second, governmental support, and third is going to be urbanization. All right, you need to know these three things. Starting with black gold, began in 1859 when a man by the name of Edwin Drake creates a steam engine that is able to drill for oil. This starts a huge oil boom in the Midwest, and we see a second one near the turn of the century in Texas. Okay, originally they started using it just to make kerosene, and kerosene would be used to as a lighting source. And kerosene changed the way Americans lived because no longer were Americans ruled by the darkness. Now they could streets were lit up with kerosene lamps. You could go anywhere, even at night. Over time, they would eventually be able to use gasoline as a byproduct. Okay, eventually that gasoline was going to be used for cars, which we still use today. Okay, but it's not the only valuable natural resources. Coal and iron are found everywhere in the United States. And one of the things that's interesting about iron is that when you remove the carbon, it makes it much lighter. It's actually more flexible and is more rust resistant than, and it's called steel. Okay, and so a man by the name of Henry Bessemer with William Kelly are going to create a new process of creating steel. What would have taken 2 weeks to make a steel would now be done in 15 minutes. So let's say you were making a steel beam, that could be made much quicker. Say you were trying to build a skyscraper. Okay? It's kind of like what Gutenberg did with the printing press in the Renaissance. We're going to see new uses for steel. See, we talked a lot about the railroad in the past, especially in the last unit, or first half of this unit, with the Wild West. But we're going to see now that the railroads, despite now that they have thousands of miles of track, are, going to slowly go away. All right? We see them using steel for so many other things, not just railroads. Barbed wire, farm equipment. They're building bridges thanks to steel. Okay? Such as the Brooklyn Bridge in 1883. And of course, the first skyscrapers, which the first one is built in Chicago in 1870 something. I can't remember right now. Alright, now let's talk about other inventions, how they spur industry. First, electricity. Thomas Edison creates the first research lab towards electricity in 1876, and within 4 years, he perfects the incandescent light bulb, which for a long time, until recently, was the standard light bulb of choice used in our homes. Now we've created a bulb that actually uses less energy than than a typical watt bulb, which is good for you because that will keep your electricity down. Okay, when that bill comes. He also created an entire system for producing and distributing electricity. Okay, uh, called direct current. All right, and by the 1890s, we're going to see factories powered by electricity. It's going to change things. Christopher Sholes is going to invent the typewriter in 1867. Now, it's going to change the way offices handle paper. It also allows more women to join the workforce. Because in 1870, there were less than 5% of the women were in the workforce. By 1910, women made up 40% of the workforce. And it's going to grow even more over the years. Telephone is also a very important invention. Okay, Alexander Graham Bell and Thomas Watson would unveil this invention in 1876. I don't think I need to say anything more about this. You know how influential it still is today. Alright, that was a quick part one. Let's move into part two, the age of the railroads. Okay, the growth and the consolidation of the railroad industry influenced American life. One of the problems, we saw some of this in the last unit, and how the railroads were affecting the farmers, and how the farmers' prices were right. They rose the prices for shipping grain across the United States, and so many railroad companies abuse their power, and so many people want to seek reforms. Remember, we talked about how in 1869 we saw the first transcontinental railroad when they placed the golden spike in Utah to signify it. Well, immigrants from China and Ireland are going to be out of work, and out of work Civil War vets help provide the most difficult labor into building this railroad. Many Americans lost their lives, especially Chinese. Um, they treated the Chinese like dirt, and these people and many of them died building the railroad. All right, because one of the things, if you're in class, we watched America: The Story of Us. We saw the Chinese Americans blowing up the rock to make a tunnel through the Rocky Mountains, and many of them died during that process. Thousands. The railroad is going to affect time. Okay, see, before 1883, every community. So let's say here in Fairfield, if we had a railroad before railroad and cars were the norm, everybody had their own time. So, for example, Boston was like 12 minutes ahead of New York. So what they would do is they would look at the position of the sun, and that's how they would base their time. Indiana, for example, had dozens of different time zones. There was no standard time reference. This is a nightmare for railroads as they're trying to schedule things to go to places. So, in 1869, years earlier, Professor C.F. Dowd proposed the idea of dividing the Earth into 24 time zones, where the U.S. would be divided into four zones: the Eastern, Central, Mountain, and Pacific. Now, you gotta remember, Hawaii was not a state at this time, and we didn't have nearly as many territories in the 1860s and 70s as we do today. Okay? Now, 1883, railroads would synchronize their watches across the U.S., and in 1884, the International Conference adopts Professor Dowd's 24-hour zones. Okay? Um, Moving on. And so here is how the world is divided into 24 time zones. So about halfway through the Pacific, so the sun rises from the east and sets all the way in the west. So we get it pretty late compared to most of the world. Most of the world is fast asleep by the time we receive what's the word? It's not the sun, but the time the sun appears where we live. Okay? Now you notice the lines aren't perfect. They do even over a little bit, but it's pretty close. So, all right, here's a better look at individual states. See, I don't understand why like states like South Dakota and Nebraska have partially, or the same with Tennessee. If you ask me, Tennessee should just stay all central. But hey, it's not that big a deal. Kind of like how part of Michigan is in central. Yeah, at that point, you might as well just stay all eastern as well. Oh well, it's not that big a deal in the end. Unlike part of Oregon too. I didn't know that. That's interesting. Sorry, I'm just discovering this for the first time, and I find this fascinating. Okay. Huh. Alright then. Well, what do you know? Yeah, there's very few states in the Pacific, but you gotta remember there's a lot of ocean. Alright. Of course, Eastern. Well, I don't know who has the most states. Anyway. Railroads are going to help affect other industry. It affects the iron, the coal, the steel, the lumber, and the glass business, as they try to keep up the railroads to demand for materials. And the spread of the railroads helps lead to the growth of new towns. New markets are added, and great opportunity for profiteers. Railroads will help lead to the growth of cities. Without without the railroad, many of our great major cities would not be where they are today. Remember, we talked about cow towns and Kansas. Most of those were all rail towns. Wichita, Abilene, Kansas, were all places where the on the open range would drop the cattle off, hop on board the train, and go over the country to different stockyards. But cities like Chicago, Minneapolis, Denver, and Seattle all grew up thanks to the railroad. Today, Chicago is still a major center of the railway. We have there's You can actually take the train across America. Now it can get expensive because unlike Europe, we don't have direct routes to just about anywhere. You have to take a lot of connecting routes. And if you have a direct line taking you to a place, so for example, if you want to go to Chicago, it's only going to cost you like 70 $80 to for a one way trip. It's pretty good for the states. But it's not going to be quite. It might be a little bit cheaper in Europe because of that. If you were in Europe, you could probably get a railway line that goes straight from Dallas to Chicago, or at least from Little Rock to Chicago. All right. But now, if you want to go to Atlanta, that's the other problem. They Amtrak, because of COVID, is about to go to 3 days a week. If they don't get more people, because they're only at half capacity anyway. Well, the best part about that is you get two seats to yourself. But I am digressing again. Moving on. Okay. So anyway, it gets more expensive depending on how many connecting routes and have to get off, and it could take just depending on the time of year and how soon you buy a ticket. The sooner you buy a ticket, the cheaper it is. For example, if I could want to go to my hometown of Atlanta, Georgia, I could hop on a train from Houston and go straight there on one line. But if I don't do it months in advance, I am probably not going to get that because that's a hot ticket line. Okay? Alright, here's a better view of how the railways connect to the 4 time zones. Alright, and I think we'll stop there for part 1. Thank you for being a good audience, and we will continue with Pullman and the factory town next time.